The bar was dimly lit, filled with the smell of fried fish and beer, the kind of place where sailors, young and reckless, told tall tales louder than the jukebox. At a corner table, a woman sat alone, her back straight despite the years weighing on her shoulders. Her hands were weathered, the kind that carried stories no one cared to ask about anymore. And then someone noticed. It wasn't her eyes, though they still carried the ocean in them. It wasn't her steady composure, though she seemed out of place among the rowdy crowd. No, it was the faded tattoo on her forearm, an anchor. Simple, inked long ago when tattoos weren't fashionable, when women especially weren't expected to wear them. A group of young sailors, fresh from their first deployment, nudged each other and chuckled. "Look at that old thing," one smirked, pointing. "Bet she got it after a drunken night in port," another chimed in. "Anchor, she probably never even touched a ship." Laughter rippled around the table, not cruel exactly, but careless, of the kind of laughter people use when they've forgotten respect. The woman heard them. She didn't flinch. She just traced the outline of the ink with her finger, as if it were a scar from another lifetime. But the bar grew quieter when the door opened, and in stepped a man whose presence cut through the noise. He wore his age with the same dignity she did, but his uniform Admiral spoke for him. The room straightened instinctively. Conversations hushed. Even the jukebox seemed to bow. The Admiral's eyes scanned the bar, and then they stopped. He saw her. For a heartbeat, no one understood. But then, to everyone's astonishment, the Admiral, decorated, revered, saluted by thousands, walked across the room. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question. He stood before the old woman and raised his hand in a crisp, unwavering salute. The sailors froze. Their laughter turned to silence. The Admiral's voice carried through the stunned room. "Mama Broken Bar, it is an honor." "This woman," he said, turning to the others, "sank 3 warships." Gasps filled the air. Someone nearly dropped a glass. The old woman finally looked up, her eyes locking with the Admiral's. They weren't filled with pride. They weren't seeking validation. Instead, they carried the heaviness of memory, of the kind only those who've seen war could carry. Her name was Margaret Maggie O'Donnell. During World War II, she had served as a nurse in the Navy. But when circumstances demanded, she did more than anyone ever expected. The Admiral explained, though softly, respectfully, as if each word was a sacred thread of history. "Most people don't know her story. Most never will. But during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when chaos raged and ships were burning, she took command of a gunnery crew after their officer was killed. She steadied men twice her size. She gave orders no one questioned. And when enemy ships bore down, it was her hand, her courage, that directed the fire, sinking 3 warships." The Admiral's voice faltered for just a second. "She saved lives that day." "She saved mine." Maggie didn't smile. She didn't bask in the revelation. Instead, she whispered, "I only did what needed to be done, what any of us would have done." But the Admiral shook his head. "Not anyone. You." The young sailors stared, their earlier mockery burning their cheeks. They weren't looking at an old tattoo anymore. They were looking at a living legend. A woman who carried history not in medals on her chest, but an ink on her skin and silence in her heart. One of them, the one who had laughed the loudest, stood up awkwardly and approached. He stumbled on his words. "Mama Broken Bar, I didn't know." "I'm sorry." Maggie finally gave a small smile, the kind that forgave more than words could. "Respect doesn't come from knowing. It comes from remembering everyone has a story you can't see." The Admiral nodded. "And some stories change the world." That night, the bar didn't return to its rowdy noise. Instead, sailors leaned in, listening. Maggie rarely spoke of her past, but for the first time in decades, she shared pieces about the friends she lost, the sacrifices she'd seen, the humanity that endured even in the darkest waters. Her anchor tattoo wasn't just ink. It was a promise she'd made to herself long ago, to never let go of the people she'd saved, nor forget the ones she couldn't. By the end of the night, those young sailors didn't see an old woman anymore. They saw the embodiment of resilience, courage, and humility. And when Maggie finally stood to leave, every sailor in the room rose to their feet. Not because the Admiral commanded it, but because respect demanded it. The Admiral offered his arm, and together they walked out into the night, leaving behind silence that spoke louder than any laughter ever could. Closing note. History often hides its greatest heroes in plain sight. Sometimes they sit quietly at the edge of a bar, carrying their battles in silence, marked only by a fading tattoo. And sometimes, when respect is forgotten, it takes a single salute, a single act of recognition to remind the world that true strength isn't in the medals, but in the hearts of those who gave everything. For the night stretched on after Maggie and the Admiral's reunion. The bar was quiet in a way no one had expected. The jukebox still hummed in the corner, but even the old country tune felt softer, almost reverent. The young sailors who had mocked her earlier now leaned forward, eager, almost desperate to hear more. And Maggie, a broken bar for the first time in years, a broken bar, began to speak. The story behind the anchor. She rested her hand on the table, her fingers brushing the faded tattoo. This anchor, she said, her voice low but steady, wasn't for a decoration. I got it when I was 18. Back then, women didn't wear tattoos. People said it was unladylike, improper. But I was headed to war, and I told myself that if an anchor could keep a ship steady in a storm, maybe it could keep me steady too. Her words were simple, but the silence that followed gave them weight. She took a breath. I was a nurse at first. Bandages, morphine, prayers whispered in the dark. That was my world. I wasn't meant to hold a rifle, let alone command a gun. But war, a broken bar. War doesn't ask what you're ready for. It just a broken bar comes. The Admiral placed a hand on her shoulder. Tell them what happened, Maggie. They should hear it. Maggie looked at him, almost reluctant. Then she nodded. The battle. It was October, 1944. Late Gulf, she began, her gaze distant as though she were looking back through the smoke of battle itself. The air was thick with fire. Our destroyer was outnumbered. Men screamed. Ships burned. I ran from patient to patient, hands covered in blood, praying I could stop at least some of it. Then a shell hit near our gunnery station. The officer was killed instantly. The men froze. They were young. Just boys really, and for a moment a broken bar. I saw terror in their eyes. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass but steadied before anyone could notice. So I picked up the radio. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe instinct, maybe desperation, but I shouted orders, clear, sharp, like I'd been born to it. And they listened. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. We fired, again and again. We weren't supposed to last 5 minutes. But somehow, a broken bar, somehow, we held our ground. I don't remember fear. I only remember faces I refused to let down. She paused, eyes glistening. By the end of it, 3 enemy ships went under. We lost friends too, but we lived. And for reasons I'll never understand, they said it was me who turned the tide. Truth is, I was just holding onto that anchor inside me, trying not to let go. The human side of heroism. The bar was utterly still. A glass clinked as someone set it down too hard, trying to hide the fact that their hands were shaking. One of the younger sailors finally spoke. About a broken bar, you weren't given a medal. Recognition? Maggie shook her head gently. Women didn't get medals for fighting back then. Not officially. I went back to nursing, patching up the wounded. That was my reward. The men I saved, that was enough. The Admiral's jaw tightened. It wasn't enough. That's why I salute you every time I see you. Because recognition or not, history owes you. Maggie gave him a look, half gratitude, half sorrow. History doesn't remember people like me, Admiral. It remembers the ships, the battles, the outcomes. Not the nurse who shouted orders when no one else would. But the Admiral turned to the sailors. And that's why you will remember, every one of you. Because you'll pass it on, and her story will never be forgotten again. The emotional climax. The young sailor who had mocked her tattoo earlier stood, his throat tight. Mama, broken bar. When I saw that anchor, I thought it was just ink, just something old. But now I see it's not just an anchor. It's a reminder that you, a broken bar you held steady when the whole world was sinking. Tears glistened in his eyes, and his voice cracked. I want to be that steady too. Maggie's expression softened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more weight than a cannon's roar. Then promise me something. Promise me that when the storm comes, and it will come, you'll hold steady. Not for yourself, but for the ones who can't. The sailor nodded, tears running freely now. And in that dim little bar, filled with salt, smoke, and silence, Something unexplainable happened. Every young man and woman there stood at once, not ordered, not commanded, but moved by respect, by awe, by something greater than themselves. One by one, they saluted her. The Admiral, standing proudly at her side, whispered, "Now you see, Maggie, a broken bar, you were never forgotten, not tonight." The closing lesson. Maggie stood, her back as straight as it had been in her youth. She looked at the faces around her, young, eager, full of life, and for the first time in decades, she let herself feel proud. "War isn't about glory," she said softly. "It's about people, about carrying each other when we can't walk on our own. That's all I ever did." And with that, she lifted her glass one last time to the ones who didn't come home. "May we always anchor them in our hearts." The room echoed with voices repeating the toast. Glasses clinked, tears fell, and an old tattoo, once mocked, became a symbol not just of survival, but of the strength to steady others in the storm. When Maggie and the Admiral finally stepped out into the night, the sailors didn't just see an old woman anymore. They saw a legacy, a reminder that greatness isn't loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner of a bar, marked only by faded ink and an unshakable heart.